Hello everyone, welcome back to the Global Conflict News channel, and please make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss an update on the shifting events of this war, because today we are diving into one of the most asked questions in modern geopolitics, and that is why Russia invades Ukraine and what lies behind this conflict that has shaken the world order and redrawn the lines of international diplomacy. To understand the exterior of the story, we must begin with the history that links Russia and Ukraine so closely that their fates have been tied together for centuries. Ukraine was once part of the Soviet Union, the vast empire that stretched across Eurasia and collapsed in 1991, leaving 15 republics independent and Russia weakened but still ambitious. For Moscow, Ukraine was never just another neighbor, it was the spiritual heart of Slavic identity, the land of Kyiv Rus, the breadbasket of Europe, and a buffer zone between Russia and the West. The exterior view is simple on the surface. Russia sees Ukraine as drifting into the orbit of NATO and the European Union, threatening Moscow's security and challenging its influence in Eastern Europe. But beneath that exterior lies a complex interior story filled with history, culture, strategy, economics, ideology, and power plays. The interior explanation begins by tracing back to the post-Cold War years, when Ukraine gained independence and immediately faced a dilemma: should it lean toward Russia or toward the West? For years, Ukraine tried to balance both paths, keeping economic ties with Moscow while seeking investment and political support from Europe. But the deeper reality is that Ukraine has always been divided internally. The eastern regions are more Russian-speaking, industrial, and historically loyal to Moscow, while the western regions are more Ukrainian-speaking, agricultural, and aligned with Europe. This divide became the battlefield of politics, where presidents came and went depending on whether they leaned pro-Russian or pro-European. Russia understood this weakness and used it to maintain influence over Kyiv, applying pressure through gas supplies, trade restrictions, and political manipulation. Ukraine meanwhile struggled with corruption, economic instability, and the lack of strong institutions, making it vulnerable to outside interference. The 2004 Orange Revolution was a turning point in Ukraine's interior narrative. Ukrainians took to the streets to protest a fraudulent election, demanding democracy and transparency. This was a clear signal to Moscow that Ukraine was moving toward Western-style governance and away from the Russian sphere. Russia saw this as a threat not only to its influence in Ukraine but to its own system of power, because if democracy succeeded in Kyiv, it could inspire Russians to challenge their own leadership. That interior fear of contagion shaped much of Moscow's thinking in the years to come. But Ukraine's progress was not linear. Corruption persisted, oligarchs retained power, and the tug-of-war between Russia and the West continued. By 2010, Viktor Yanukovych, a pro-Russian figure, was elected president, giving Moscow hope that Ukraine would remain under its wing. Yet even then, Ukraine's people continued to demand closer ties with Europe, seeing in the European Union a chance for a better future, stronger economy, and freedom from Russia's shadow. The decisive moment came in 2013, when Yanukovych suddenly abandoned a long-negotiated deal with the European Union under pressure from Moscow and instead turned toward Russia. This sparked massive protests in Kyiv's Maidan Square, known as the Euromaidan movement, where thousands demanded not only European integration but also the end of corruption and authoritarianism. The protests grew, clashes erupted, and eventually Yanukovych fled the country in 2014. This was the breaking point for Moscow. Russia's leadership believed the West had orchestrated a coup in Ukraine, stealing their closest ally and placing a pro-Western government at Russia's doorstep. For Russia, this was intolerable. The annexation of Crimea soon followed, justified by Moscow as protecting Russian speakers and strategic interests, particularly the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. The war in Donbass also erupted, with Russian-backed separatists fighting Ukrainian forces, leading to a conflict that simmered for 8 years before the full-scale invasion of 2022. Inside the Russian mindset, Ukraine is not just about territory, it is about identity, security, and power. Putin has repeatedly said that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, separated only by artificial borders created by Soviet leaders. He believes that Ukraine's independence is valid only if it aligns with Russian interests, and that NATO expansion to Ukraine would be an existential threat. For Putin and many in the Russian elite, The Cold War never truly ended, it merely paused, and the West continued to encroach on what they see as Russia's natural sphere of influence. NATO's enlargement to include Poland, the Baltic states, and other Eastern European countries was seen in Moscow as humiliation and betrayal. Ukraine was the final red line. From the interior perspective, the invasion is Moscow's way of redrawing those lines by force, showing the world that Russia will not allow NATO to surround it, and reasserting itself as a great power. It is also about domestic politics. Putin uses the narrative of defending Russians abroad and fighting Western aggression to strengthen his hold on power at home, rallying nationalist sentiment and silencing dissent. The performance of Russia's military campaign, however, has been far from smooth. Moscow expected a quick victory, believing its troops would be welcomed in Kyiv or at least face little resistance. Instead, Ukraine fought back fiercely, with the support of Western weapons, intelligence, and economic sanctions on Russia. What was supposed to be a rapid operation turned into a grinding war of attrition, exposing flaws in Russia's military, corruption in its logistics, and the resilience of Ukraine's forces. Performance here refers not only to tanks and missiles but also to the performance of narratives. Russia portrays itself as the victim of Western plots, while Ukraine presents itself as the defender of freedom and democracy. The battle is fought on the ground and online, with information as much a weapon as artillery. When we talk about safety features in this conflict, they manifest in diplomacy, deterrence, and nuclear threats. Russia repeatedly signals its nuclear arsenal as a warning to NATO not to intervene directly. Ukraine seeks safety in Western alliances, though NATO membership remains distant. The safety net for Ukraine comes in the form of international sanctions on Russia, weapons shipments, and financial aid, but these are fragile features, dependent on political will in Europe and the United States. The fear is that if these safety features fail, Ukraine could be overrun, or the war could escalate into a larger confrontation between nuclear powers. The unique selling points of Russia's invasion, if one can use that term, are tied to the messages Moscow sells to its own people and to parts of the world outside the West. Russia frames itself as a defender of tradition against Western liberalism, a champion of sovereignty against foreign interference, and a power that resists the unipolar world dominated by the United States. These selling points resonate with some countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, who see their own grievances with the West reflected in Russia's defiance. Ukraine, on the other hand, has its own unique appeal. It is the underdog, the smaller nation resisting a giant, the symbol of courage and resilience in the face of overwhelming force. The war has made Ukraine a global icon, rallying support and admiration across much of the world. The price of this invasion, however, has been catastrophic. For Ukraine, the price is measured in lives lost, cities destroyed, millions displaced, and an economy shattered. For Russia, the price is thousands of soldiers killed, sanctions that cripple the economy, international isolation, and a future tied ever more tightly to China. For the world, the price is higher food and energy costs, destabilized markets, and the return of great power rivalry that threatens global security. The war has reminded everyone that the price of unchecked aggression is not confined to borders, it ripples across continents, affecting ordinary people far from the battlefield. In conclusion, why Russia invades Ukraine cannot be answered by a single reason but by a web of history, identity, geopolitics, security fears, and power ambitions. The exterior shows us the visible clash between East and West, but the interior reveals centuries of shared history and unresolved tensions. The performance has exposed strengths and weaknesses on both sides, the safety features are fragile and dangerous, the unique selling points are narratives spun for global audiences, and the price is one that all humanity pays. The war is not only about territory but about the shape of the world order in the 21st century. Ukraine stands as a front line of freedom, while Russia insists it is defending its own existence. The struggle will define not just their future but ours as well.